My name is Adam Hamilton, and it's a joy once more to take you on the journey that Mary and Joseph took as they approached the very first Christmas. We began our study of the journey by visiting the hometown of Mary, the town of Nazareth, where she learned that she would have a child. Today we turn to Joseph's story and how he learned that Mary would give birth to the Messiah. A careful reading of the Gospels leads many scholars to believe that Joseph's hometown was Bethlehem and that his engagement to Mary was a long-distance engagement. For this reason, as we study Joseph's story, let's visit Bethlehem to see some of the things you'd see if you were to visit Bethlehem today.
Bethlehem means house of bread, and it was here that he had grown up, and his parents and his grandparents before him, all the way back to the time of King David. And this village had a rich history in the scriptures. There's David, born to Jesse. And David, as he grows up, is shepherding sheep here in this area, in the hillsides of Bethlehem. It's here that he's anointed by Samuel to become the next king of Israel. And it was this city that became the city of David. Of course, we remember other stories. When David was near death in 2 Samuel chapter 23, we find that he tells his most mighty warriors that he's thirsty, and he sends them back to Bethlehem, which had now become a Philistine stronghold. And they go back to the wells, and they draw water from the wells of Bethlehem, his home village, to bring to the dying king. I sit here at the three wells that represent that story in the text, in the scriptures. And after the time of King David, the hope that the Israelites had that one day God would send another king like David, a messianic figure, we find that in the book of Micah, chapter 5, where we read these words, "But you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times. He will stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they will live securely, for then his greatness will reach to the ends of the earth, and he will be their peace." Joseph, born in Bethlehem, raised in Bethlehem, has no idea that the child that he will raise, Mary's child, will fulfill these words of the prophet Micah. Bethlehem was a town of perhaps 500 people in the time of Joseph. It was a town of wheat and barley farmers, millers, and bakers. I believe this is why it was called Bethlehem, which means the house of bread. As Nazareth, the branch, was a town with messianic connotations, so too was Bethlehem, both because of its association with King David and also its mention by Micah. Bethlehem was then, and is today, still home to shepherds as well, and those shepherds will play an important role in this story on the night that Jesus was born. We can also assume that there was at least one family of carpenters there. The Greek word for carpenter is tekton, and it could mean someone who builds things, or someone who works with wood, or even a stonemason. Often, carpenters built farm implements. Joseph was a carpenter. Joseph is only mentioned a handful of times in the Gospels and never outside of them. But if we're paying attention, even those handful of verses tell us a lot about this man. We know that he's mentioned as being present in Luke's Gospel when Jesus was 12 years old. It's likely that Joseph died before Jesus began his public ministry at the age of 30. This leads us to two different traditions about the age of Joseph when he became the earthly father of Jesus. Protestants tend to imagine Joseph as a relatively young man. Once a young man was old enough to support a wife through plying his trade, he married. This was likely somewhere between the ages of 14 and 16. Now, how does imagining Joseph as a, let's say, 15-year-old or 16-year-old change how you read Joseph's story? After the birth of Jesus, Joseph is forced to take Mary and Jesus and flee to Egypt because King Herod wants to kill the child. Can you picture this 15-year-old young man taking Mary and becoming an immigrant in Egypt with a brand new baby? Can you imagine the responsibility he felt, accepting not only Mary as his wife, but primarily accepting the role of fathering this child who was to be the Messiah at the age of 15? But not everyone imagines Joseph as a young man. Beginning in the 2nd century, Christians began to think of Joseph as an elderly man, a widower who had children by a previous wife, the siblings of Jesus mentioned in the Gospels. According to these traditions, Joseph was 93 when he married Mary. This allowed him to be a grandfatherly figure to Mary and preserved her perpetual virginity, as it was thought that such an elderly man would never have sought to consummate his marriage. It was said that Joseph lived to be 111. Though the story may seem a bit fanciful, Joseph is often portrayed in artwork and in nativity sets as an aged man. And for this very reason, it's helpful to check your nativity set just to see, do you see Joseph portrayed as a young man like this particular nativity, or as an aged man? And if he's portrayed as an aged man, the set may have been designed by an Eastern Orthodox Christian or a Catholic artist.
This is showing a young man, which could have been designed by either of those two, but might more likely have been designed by a Protestant. Although this Joseph has a pretty full beard for a 15-year-old. Now, in the last session, we considered the announcement to Mary that she would bear the Christ. Luke's account of Christmas is focused on Mary, but Matthew focuses on Joseph. So let's take a look at Matthew 1:18 through 24 and see what Joseph's Annunciation story teaches us about Joseph and about the child to be born to Mary. Now, the birth of Jesus the Messiah took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been engaged to Joseph, but before they lived together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. Her husband Joseph, being a righteous man and unwilling to expose her to public disgrace, planned to dismiss her quietly. But just when he had resolved to do this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, "Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins." All this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. "Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel," which means God is with us. When Joseph awoke from sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took her as his wife. Notice that Matthew calls Joseph a righteous man. Let's consider this for a moment and what it teaches us about Joseph and about God's will for our lives. Matthew illustrates what he means by righteous by noting that upon hearing that Mary was pregnant with a child that was not his own, he was more concerned for her honor and safety than for his own honor. The punishment that the law of Moses prescribed for women who were engaged and who became pregnant by another was death by stoning. Joseph, being a righteous man, did not want this to happen to her. What does righteousness mean then? It doesn't mean justice, nor obedience to the law of Moses. Righteousness here means mercy. Now let's pause for a moment to consider this dimension of Joseph's character. Imagine what you would be feeling if you were engaged and you found out that your future spouse either was pregnant or had impregnated someone else. What would you be feeling? I mean, I'd be feeling hurt and anger, and I'd be confused, and my whole world would feel like it was falling apart. Now, Joseph had to have had those same feelings. But even then, when he had the right to be angry, he showed mercy instead. Now, how do you think Joseph's merciful character shaped Jesus as Jesus was growing up? There's more we see about Joseph in this passage, of course, in Matthew. We learn that he heard from God in dreams, just like his biblical namesake, Joseph, the son of Jacob, who also heard from God in dreams. It's not by accident that Matthew mentions this. Matthew's gospel was written to Jews, and he intentionally tries to highlight connections between Jesus and the Old Testament story. Notice that Joseph is always obedient to God's dreams. Even when that means moving hundreds of miles away, he always does what God reveals to him in the dreams. Now, before we begin our journey back to Bethlehem, consider for a moment what the Annunciation story of Matthew tells us about Jesus. What do we learn here about the child to be born of Mary? Read carefully the section of this chapter in the book related to the words of Isaiah's prophecy quoted in Matthew, the Emmanuel passage. I've tried to teach you something really important in the book about how you read this particular prophecy and how the idea of Emmanuel teaches us something about God's will for our lives today. We'll see more of Bethlehem, including what may be a portion of Joseph's childhood home in chapter 5. But for now, I'd like you to see what was the most amazing sight just outside of Bethlehem. People would have come from all over to Bethlehem just to see this marvel. It was Judea's equivalent of the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt. And it was built shortly before Joseph was born. It was built by King Herod the Great as a testament to his greatness. I'm standing just south of the little town of Bethlehem. And in the background, what you can see is what appears to be a mountain, almost like a volcano. But it's not naturally occurring. This was man-made. It was made by King Herod the Great to celebrate a victory he had in battle. I want you to notice this. From the place that Jesus was born, from the hometown of Joseph, you see this every day from almost every place in the town. Let's go in and take a closer look at King Herod's monument. Here we're ascending to the top of the Herodium. And you can see here what remains of the artificial pools and lake that Herod built, and the villas in the foreground where his friends stayed. And here, as you ascend the Herodium, you find the 900-seat amphitheater built into the side of the mountain. Talk about a home theater. Atop this mountain, the king built a palace for himself 400 feet in the air. The Great Pyramid of Giza was only 350 feet by comparison. To get to it, you have to walk through the tunnels in the side of the mountain and then ascend the stairs, and finally you arrive here at the king's palace. Here there were storerooms, hot and cold Roman baths, suites, and a veranda from which you could see the little town of Bethlehem. It was stunning and is stunning to walk across the top. I wanted you to see Herod's palace near Bethlehem, his testament to his own greatness, as you think about the man God chose to be the earthly father of Jesus. Herod stands in stark contrast to Joseph. Mark tells us that Joseph was a carpenter. The Greek word, as we've learned, is tekton. And since only certain portions of homes were made of wood, it typically referred to someone who was building doors, roofs, maybe farm implements, though the term could be used of stonemasons as well. They were hardworking and humble people. Now, if you were particularly successful, you could become an architecton. You recognize that as its English equivalent, architect. Architectons were master builders. But Joseph isn't called this. He was just a tecton. Now, when I think of Joseph, I think of my great-grandfather, whose name was also Joseph, and who was himself a builder and a woodworker. He was a man of his word, a humble man with a strength of character. His word was his bond, and one of the great treasures that I have is his toolbox. This is his toolbox. And many of the tools were similar to the tools that were used by people in Joseph's day. They didn't change much over the centuries. Now, here's the thing to note about tectons. They didn't have 401ks. They didn't have large tracts of land they farmed. They didn't have herds of sheep where they stored their wealth. Everything of value that they had could be fit in a toolbox like this. Tectons were humble, hardworking people. And it's interesting that Joseph, he was a hardworking, humble person. We can easily imagine what he was like. But what's really interesting is that Joseph doesn't have a single line in the New Testament. There are no hymns praising him. No, "Hail Joseph, full of grace, the Lord is with you." Joseph was merciful, he was obedient, he was humble. And I think it was for these reasons that God chose him to be the earthly father of his son. Herod called himself great and built massive palaces to prove it. Joseph wouldn't have dared to call himself great, but demonstrated true greatness by living a life of mercy, obedience, and humility. How do you define greatness?